Yorkshire, October 1818. The dressing room at Hargrave Manor smelled of desperation, a cloying mixture of wilted orange blossoms, cold sweat, and the acrid smoke of hastily extinguished candles. Clarissa Hargrave stood frozen before the pier glass, her reflection fractured as her mother's hands yanked the ivory silk bodice tighter, stealing the very breath from her ribs. "Stand still," Lady Hargrave hissed, her fingers working with violent efficiency through the dozens of pearl buttons marching up Clarissa's spine. "We have less than an hour before the carriage arrives, and you will be perfection itself, do you understand?" But this was not Clarissa's gown. The elaborate confection of Venetian lace and seed pearls had been commissioned for her elder sister, the beautiful, accomplished Venetia, who should have been standing here instead, preparing to marry Maximilian Crowe, Duke of Bellingham. The same Venetia who 12 hours earlier had vanished into the autumn night with a penniless cavalry captain, leaving behind nothing but a tear-stained confession and the smoking ruins of her family's last hope for salvation. If stories of impossible choices and forbidden truths move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. The letter had arrived at dawn, delivered by Venetia's lady's maid, with hands that shook so violently, the wax seal had cracked before Lady Hargrave could break it. Clarissa had watched her mother's face transform from confusion to horror, to a terrible, calculating determination as she read her eldest daughter's words. "Dearest Mamma and Papa," Venetia had written in her elegant script, "by the time you read this, I shall be beyond your reach. I cannot marry the Duke of Bellingham. I do not love him, and I find I cannot sacrifice my happiness for the preservation of our family's circumstances, however dire they may be. Captain Thornfield and I departed for Scotland this evening. We shall be married by the time you wake. I am sorry for the pain this will cause, but I must follow my heart. Your loving daughter, Venetia." Baron Hargrave had aged a decade in the space of that single morning. Slumped in his study chair, still wearing yesterday's wrinkled evening clothes, he had looked at his wife with the hollow eyes of a condemned man. "We are destroyed," he said simply. "The Duke's solicitors will demand the return of the advance on Venetia's dowry, money we have already spent settling my debts. When we cannot produce it, I shall be imprisoned. The estate will be seized. Everything, Margaret, everything." It was then that Lady Hargrave's gaze had fallen upon Clarissa, who stood forgotten in the doorway, still in her nightdress, her dark chestnut hair loose about her shoulders. Where Venetia had their mother's bright green eyes, Clarissa's were an unusual shade of violet, thoughtful, observant eyes of a silent watcher. The calculating gleam in her mother's eyes had made Clarissa's blood run cold. "No," Clarissa had whispered, understanding blooming like poison in her chest. "Mamma, no, you cannot possibly—" "You will wear your sister's gown," Lady Hargrave interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You will stand beside the Duke in that chapel. You will speak your vows with your face concealed behind the modesty veil. And you will save this family from complete and utter ruin." "But it is fraud," Clarissa protested, her voice rising in desperate pitch. "Deception of the worst kind. The Duke has contracted to marry Venetia, not me. It is illegal, it is immoral, it is necessary." Her father's voice cut through her objections like a blade through silk. He had risen from his chair, and for the first time in her 19 years, Clarissa saw genuine steel in his spine. "Your sister has condemned us all with her selfishness. You, Clarissa, will repair what she has broken. Or would you prefer to see your mother and younger siblings cast into the street, your brother James removed from university, the family name destroyed beyond all redemption?" The words had hung in the morning air like an executioner's axe, poised and ready to fall. "The Duke has never met Venetia in person," Lady Hargrave continued, her practicality reasserting itself now that the decision had been made. "All negotiations were conducted through correspondence and your father's meetings with his solicitors. The marriage contract specifies Venetia's name, but it was drafted in such a way that refers to her position as the eldest daughter of Baron Hargrave, a technicality we hope to exploit. We need only maintain the deception through the ceremony and the wedding night. After that, you will be the Duchess of Bellingham in truth as well as in law, and there will be nothing anyone can do to undo it." "Unless he discovers the substitution," Clarissa had said quietly, her voice hollow with the weight of what they were asking her to become. What then? Her mother's silence had been answer enough. Now, hours later, Clarissa stared at her transformed reflection and scarcely recognized the woman looking back. The gown fit reasonably well. She and Venetia shared a similar height and slender build, though Clarissa's figure was more delicate, less voluptuous than her sister's renowned beauty. Her dark chestnut hair had been arranged in an elaborate coiffure studded with tiny white roses, and her mother had insisted on painting her lips with the faintest touch of carmine. But it was the veil that would make the deception possible. 3 layers of fine Bruges lace, so densely woven that it rendered her features nearly invisible, hung from a coronet of orange blossoms and would remain in place, her mother insisted, until after the ceremony had been completed and the register signed. "The Duke is a widower," Lady Hargrave said, adjusting the fall of the veil with critical precision. "His first wife died in childbed 2 years past, along with their infant son. He is marrying again purely for duty, to secure an heir and fulfill the expectations of his position. He will not look too closely at his bride's face during the ceremony, particularly if we cite modesty and tradition as reasons for the veil." "And after," Clarissa whispered, "when he removes the veil in our bridal chamber? When he sees that I am not Venetia?" Her mother's hand stilled for just a moment on the lace. Then she resumed her adjustments, her voice carefully neutral. "By then, my dear, it will be too late. The marriage will have been consummated. You will be his wife in every sense that matters, regardless of which name was spoken at the altar." The ruthless pragmatism of it made Clarissa's stomach turn. But what choice did she have? Her family's survival hung by a thread, and she was the knife being used to cut it or strengthen it. She thought of her younger sister Emma, only 14, whose prospects for any decent marriage would evaporate if the family fell into disgrace. She thought of James, her brother, whose dreams of a military career required money and connections they would no longer possess. She thought of her father in debtor's prison, her mother forced to seek refuge with disdainful relatives, the Hargrave name becoming a cautionary tale whispered in London drawing rooms. "I will do it," she said at last, the words tasting of ashes in her mouth. "But I will not pretend this is anything other than what it is, a terrible deception that may destroy us all when the truth emerges." "The truth," her mother replied, stepping back to survey her handiwork with grim satisfaction, "is whatever we choose to make it. Now come. The carriage awaits, and we must not keep your bridegroom waiting." The chapel at Ravenstone Hall lay 30 miles distant across Yorkshire's windswept moors. Clarissa made the journey in numb silence, her father beside her in the carriage, neither of them able to meet the other's eyes. The October landscape passed in a blur of grey stone walls and dying heather, the autumn sun already sinking toward the horizon, though it was barely past noon. Ravenstone Hall rose from the northern Yorkshire moors not as a house, but as a geological feature, a structure of grey granite so severe it seemed to have been eroded by the salt wind from the North Sea. The windows were narrow slits, and the air around it carried the clean, cold scent of wet stone and solitude. The Duke's estate was vast, encompassing thousands of acres of moorland and forest, and the hall itself had stood for 3 centuries, weathering wars and winters with equal stoicism. As their carriage rolled up the long drive, Clarissa caught glimpses of the house through her veil, its severe facade, the ancient oak trees that surrounded it like sentinels, the chapel spire rising from the eastern wing. Everything about the place spoke of permanence, tradition, and a weight of history that made her feel suddenly, crushingly insignificant. The wedding party was small. The Duke had no close family remaining, her mother had explained, and he had expressed a preference for a quiet, private ceremony. Only his closest household staff and a handful of local gentry would attend. For Clarissa's family, this intimacy was a blessing. Fewer witnesses to their deception, fewer chances for someone to notice that the bride's hands trembled, that her voice caught when speaking her vows, that she was not quite the woman the Duke expected. Clarissa was escorted to a small anteroom adjacent to the chapel, where her mother made final adjustments to her gown and veil. Through the walls, she could hear the muted sounds of the gathering guests, the soft preparations for the ceremony that would bind her to a man she had never met. "Remember, Lady Hargrave whispered urgently, gripping Clarissa's shoulders with surprising strength. "You are Venetia. You speak for Venetia. When they ask for your name in the register, you sign as Venetia Hargrave. Do you understand?" "I understand that I am committing fraud," Clarissa replied, her voice muffled behind the heavy veil, "that I am deceiving a man who has done nothing to deserve such dishonesty." "You are saving your family," her mother corrected sharply. "Everything else is luxury we cannot afford." Before Clarissa could respond, the chapel bells began to ring. The ceremony was beginning. Her father appeared at the door, his expression carefully neutral, his arm extended. Clarissa took it, feeling the slight tremor in his hand that matched her own, and together they walked toward the chapel entrance. The doors swung open, and suddenly she was standing at the head of the aisle, candles blazing on either side, the gathered witnesses turning to watch her approach, and at the altar, waiting with his back turned, stood Maximilian Crowe, Duke of Bellingham. Even from behind he cut an imposing figure. Tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in immaculate black evening clothes that emphasized the severe lines of his frame, he stood with the rigid posture of a military officer. When he turned to watch her approach, Clarissa's breath caught. His face was striking rather than handsome, all sharp angles and patrician bones, with a jaw that looked carved from granite and cheekbones that cast shadows in the candlelight. His hair was an unusual shade of silver grey, premature for his 34 years, and his eyes, when they met hers through the veil, were the colour of winter storms. There was no warmth in that gaze, no anticipation or pleasure, only a grim determination that matched her own. This was a man, Clarissa understood in that instant, who approached marriage as he might approach a particularly unpleasant duty, and she was about to trap him in a union based entirely on lies. Her feet moved forward of their own accord, carrying her down the aisle toward her fate. The priest waited beside the Duke, prayer book in hand, his expression serene with the certainty of his calling. He had no idea he was about to conduct a ceremony founded on deception. Clarissa reached the altar. Her father placed her hand in the Duke's, and Clarissa nearly gasped at the shock of contact, even through their gloves. His hand was large and strong, his grip firm and cool, and for a moment she felt his fingers tighten slightly, as though testing the weight and size of the hand in his. Did he notice? Could he feel that these hands were smaller than Venetia's, more delicate? Her sister had been a keen horsewoman and pianist with strong, capable fingers. Clarissa's hands were those of a scholar and reader, soft and narrow. But the Duke said nothing. He released her hand and turned to face the priest, and the ceremony began. The words washed over Clarissa in a blur of Latin and English, sacred and binding. She heard herself respond when required, her voice barely above a whisper, muffled by the veil's heavy layers. When the priest asked for her name for the register, she hesitated only a fraction of a second before speaking the lie that would make everything else possible. Venetia Hargrave. The Duke signed first, his signature bold and decisive. Maximilian Crowe, Duke of Bellingham. Then Clarissa took the pen, her hand shaking so badly she could barely form the letters, and wrote the name that was not her own, Venetia Hargrave. The fraud was complete. They were married. "You may kiss your bride, Your Grace," the priest intoned with benevolent satisfaction. The Duke turned to her, and for a moment Clarissa's heart hammered so violently she thought she might faint. Would he lift the veil now? Would the deception be discovered before it had even truly begun? But he merely raised the edge of the veil slightly, just enough to expose her lips, nothing more, and pressed a brief, cool kiss to her mouth. It lasted no more than a heartbeat, perfunctory and entirely without passion, before he lowered the veil again and offered her his arm. "Duchess," he said, the title sounding strange and foreign applied to her. They processed back down the aisle as man and wife, and Clarissa felt as though she were attending her own funeral. The wedding breakfast that followed was a subdued affair held in Ravenstone's formal dining room. Clarissa kept her veil in place, citing maiden modesty and exhaustion from the journey, and picked at the elaborate meal without tasting any of it. The Duke sat at her right hand, making polite conversation with the local gentry who had attended, while Clarissa's parents maintained careful distance, as though afraid proximity might somehow expose their deception. Through it all, Clarissa was acutely aware of her new husband's presence beside her. He spoke little directly to her, and when he did, each word was carefully measured, delivered with precise politeness that left no room for intimacy. This was not a love match, his manner proclaimed. This was a business arrangement, and he would fulfill his obligations with the same methodical precision he doubtless brought to the management of his vast estates. As the afternoon waned into evening, Clarissa's sense of impending doom grew heavier. Soon her family would depart for their return journey to Yorkshire. Soon she would be alone in this vast, cold house with a man who believed he had married someone else entirely. Soon the veil would have to come off, and the truth, inevitable, terrible, would be revealed. "It is time," her mother whispered, appearing at her elbow as the guests began to take their leave. "Your trunks have been sent up to the Duchess's chambers. Remember what I told you. Be modest but compliant, and for heaven's sake keep your nerve." Clarissa wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Keep your nerve while deceiving your husband on your wedding night. But the sound caught in her throat, emerging as something closer to a sob. Her mother's hand tightened warningly on her arm. "You can do this, Clarissa, you must." For the briefest instant, her mother's grip on her arm felt less like a command and more like desperation. A drowning woman clinging to a lifeline. Then it released abruptly. Lady Hargrave turned away, her mask of determination settling back into place. Clarissa stood in the great hall of Ravenstone, watching as her family climbed into their carriage and disappeared into the gathering dusk, abandoning her to her fate. The Duke stood beside her, silent and imposing, and when the carriage was finally lost from sight, he turned to her with the same formal politeness that maintained an invisible wall between them. "You must be fatigued from the day's events," he said. "Shall I have my housekeeper escort you to your chambers? I have business to attend to in my study, but I shall join you presently." It was a reprieve, however temporary. Clarissa nodded mutely, and the housekeeper, a severe woman named Mrs. Blackwood, appeared to lead her through the maze of corridors to what would now be her rooms. The Duchess's chambers occupied the eastern wing of Ravenstone Hall, a suite of rooms that had apparently been closed since the death of the Duke's first wife. Mrs. Blackwood threw open the doors with barely concealed disapproval, as though Clarissa's very presence was an insult to the memory of the previous occupant. "The Duke has ordered these rooms reopened and refreshed for your arrival, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, the title sounding like an accusation on her lips. "If you require anything, you need only ring. Your lady's maid should be arriving shortly. She traveled ahead with your trunks." Then she was gone, and Clarissa was alone in rooms that felt haunted by the ghost of a woman she would never meet. The chambers were beautiful in their way, all heavy velvet drapes and dark mahogany furniture, with tall windows overlooking the cliffs and the restless sea beyond. But there was no warmth here, no sense of welcome, only the chill of abandonment and the weight of expectation. Clarissa moved to the window, finally lifting the veil from her face with trembling hands. The autumn evening had deepened into twilight, and she could see the waves breaking against the rocks far below, their white foam phosphorescent in the fading light. This was her prison now, she realized. This house, this marriage, this life, built on a foundation of lies. A soft knock at the door made her spin around, her heart leaping into her throat. "Come," she managed, her voice hoarse. But it was only her temporary lady's maid, a local girl borrowed from the household staff, arriving to help her prepare for the night ahead. The girl helped Clarissa out of the elaborate wedding gown with efficient, impersonal hands, replacing it with a nightdress of fine white lawn trimmed with delicate lace. Then she brushed out Clarissa's dark hair, plaiting it into a loose braid that fell over one shoulder, and finally withdrew with a murmured curtsy. Clarissa was left standing in the center of the room, dressed in her bridal nightgown, waiting for the moment when her deception would be exposed and all her careful pretense would shatter. She did not have to wait long. Perhaps 20 minutes after the maid departed, she heard heavy footsteps in the corridor outside. The connecting door to the Duke's chambers, a door she had not even noticed in her initial survey of the room, swung open without ceremony. Maximilian Crowe entered his bride's chamber with the bearing of a man fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. He had removed his jacket and cravat and his white shirt was open at the collar, revealing a column of tanned throat that suggested time spent outdoors, despite his aristocratic station. He carried a brandy glass in one hand, and the faint smell of tobacco clung to his clothes, suggesting he had indeed spent the intervening time in his study, fortifying himself for the duty ahead. He stopped just inside the room, his grey eyes sweeping over her with clinical assessment. Clarissa stood frozen beside the bed, her braid falling forward over one shoulder, her hands clasped tightly at her waist to stop their trembling. "Well," he said at last, his voice carrying that same cool distance she had heard during the ceremony. "Shall we proceed with this business, Venetia?" The false name on his lips was like a blade between her ribs. Clarissa opened her mouth to speak, to confess, to explain, to beg his forgiveness before the deception went any further. But no words emerged. The Duke crossed the room toward her with deliberate steps. He set his brandy glass aside on the nightstand, and then his hands rose to cup her face, tilting it up toward the candlelight so he could finally, properly, see his bride's features. The moment seemed to stretch into eternity. Clarissa watched his expression as comprehension slowly dawned. The slight narrowing of his eyes, the tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers suddenly gripped her face with bruising pressure. "You," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "are not Venetia Hargrave." The words hung between them like an accusation and a curse. Clarissa felt tears spring to her eyes, hot and shameful, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "No," she whispered, "I am not." For a long moment the Duke said nothing. His hands remained on her face, his grip firm enough to prevent her from looking away, and Clarissa could see the fury building behind his eyes like a gathering storm. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Explain. Now." So she did. Standing there in her bridal nightdress with his hands still gripping her face, Clarissa told him everything. Venetia's elopement, her family's desperate circumstances, the coercion and threats that had forced her into this deception. She held nothing back, her voice shaking but determined, and with every word she watched his expression grow colder and more terrible. When she finished, he released her face so abruptly she stumbled backward. He turned away, one hand rising to rake through his silver-grey hair, and the string of profanity that emerged from his lips made Clarissa flinch. "Do you comprehend?" he said, spinning back to face her, his voice now shaking with barely contained rage. "What you have done, what your family has done, this is fraud, madam, criminal fraud. The marriage contract was negotiated for Venetia Hargrave. I agreed to marry Venetia Hargrave. I signed a register binding myself to Venetia Hargrave. And instead," he gestured at her with something approaching disgust, "instead I find myself wed to some substitute, some impostor foisted upon me through the most contemptible deception." "I know," Clarissa said, her voice barely audible. "I know, and I am sorry, more sorry than you can possibly imagine. I did not wish to deceive you, but they gave me no choice. They said..." "Choice?" The Duke's laugh was bitter and harsh. "Your family has stolen my choice, madam. They have bound me to a woman I never contracted to marry, through lies and manipulation and fraud, and you..." His eyes raked over her with something between fury and calculation. "You allowed them to use you as their instrument." "What else could I do?" Clarissa found herself shouting, all her fear transmuting suddenly into anger of her own. "Stand aside and watch my family destroyed, my father imprisoned, my younger siblings cast into poverty. Yes, it was deception, and yes, it was wrong, but I am not the villain here. I am merely the sacrifice they demanded, and you, your grace, are the altar upon which I was laid." The raw honesty of it seemed to give him pause. He stared at her for a long moment, and some of the fury drained from his expression, replaced by something more complicated, a mixture of frustration, calculation, and a weariness that aged him beyond his years. "Your name," he said at last. "Your real name." "Clarissa," she whispered. "Clarissa Hargrave. I am Venetia's younger sister." Clarissa. He tested the name on his tongue, as though trying to reconcile it with the woman standing before him. "And how old are you, Clarissa Hargrave?" 19, nearly 20. Another stream of profanity, quieter this time but no less heartfelt. The Duke moved to the window, staring out at the darkened cliffs and the sea beyond. For a long while he said nothing, and Clarissa waited in an agony of suspense, uncertain whether he was about to call for his solicitors and have her arrested, or simply throw her bodily from the house. When he finally spoke, his voice had regained some of its earlier coldness, but beneath it Clarissa detected a thread of grim pragmatism. "The marriage," he said, still not looking at her, "has not yet been consummated. An annulment could potentially be obtained on grounds of fraud and misrepresentation. Your family would be exposed, of course, and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. You yourself would be returned to them in disgrace, your reputation destroyed beyond redemption. But I would be free of this entanglement." Hope and dread warred in Clarissa's chest. She said nothing, sensing he was not finished. "However," the Duke continued, turning to face her at last, "an annulment creates complications of its own. The scandal would be considerable. My family's name would be dragged through every gossip column in London. The negotiations with your father, the contracted dowry, the circumstances of our marriage, all of it would become public spectacle. And his jaw tightened. "I have had quite enough of being the subject of society's pity and speculation." "What are you saying?" Clarissa asked quietly. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw something that made her blood run cold. Not anger, but calculation. Cold, ruthless calculation. "I am saying, madam, that we appear to be trapped in this farce together, at least for the immediate present. You need a husband to avoid complete social destruction. I need—" He paused, and something painful flickered across his features. "I need an heir, a legitimate heir to inherit this dukedom and all that comes with it. That was the sole purpose of this marriage arrangement." Clarissa felt her heart sink into her stomach. She understood what he was suggesting, and the cold pragmatism of it made her want to weep. "So," the Duke continued, his voice flat and emotionless, "I propose a bargain. We remain married, at least for now. We fulfill the physical obligations necessary to produce an heir. If you become pregnant within the year, the marriage stands. You will remain Duchess of Bellingham, with all the privileges and protections that title affords. If you do not conceive within that time," he shrugged, "then we shall revisit the question of annulment, and I shall ensure you are provided for with a property and income sufficient to live independently." "And my family?" Clarissa asked, though she already knew the answer. "Will be left alone, provided they maintain absolute silence about the true circumstances of our marriage. One word of this reaches society, and I will personally ensure your father spends the rest of his days in debtor's prison." It was blackmail, pure and simple. But it was also, Clarissa recognized, far more mercy than they deserved. The Duke could have had them all arrested this very night. Instead, he was offering a path forward, however cold and pragmatic. "And if I agree to these terms," Clarissa said slowly, "what then? How do we proceed?" The Duke's expression hardened. "We proceed," he said, "with the consummation of this fraudulent marriage. Because make no mistake, madam, annulment or no, the law will recognize no grounds for dissolution once the marriage has been completed in full. And I will not live the rest of my life bound to a woman with whom I have never shared a bed, wondering if tomorrow she will petition to be free of me." Clarissa felt her face flame with embarrassment and something else, fear perhaps, or the terrible awareness of what he was demanding. But she forced herself to nod. "Very well," she whispered. "I accept your terms." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps that she had agreed so readily. He studied her face for a long moment, and Clarissa wondered what he saw, not the beautiful, accomplished Venetia he had expected. Just Clarissa, with her dark chestnut hair and unusual violet eyes, her slender frame and unremarkable features. "You are not," he said at last, his voice oddly gentle despite its coldness, "what I anticipated, in any particular." "I am sorry for that," Clarissa replied, and found that she meant it. "Truly sorry." He nodded slowly, accepting her apology without acknowledging it. Then he moved toward her with deliberate steps, and Clarissa's heart began to hammer against her ribs. "Come," he said, his voice dropping to something quieter. more intimate. Let us complete this bargain before either of us loses our nerve. What followed was neither violent nor cruel, but it was devoid of tenderness or warmth. The Duke approached the deflowering of his unwanted bride with the same methodical efficiency he doubtless brought to the management of his estates, necessary, procedural, accomplished, with a minimum of fuss or unnecessary emotion. He was not unkind, precisely, but neither was there any affection in his touch, any gentleness in the way he guided her to the bed, and proceeded with the act that would bind them irrevocably together. Clarissa closed her eyes, not to hide from him, but to retreat within herself. She focused on the damask pattern of the bed canopy above, tracing its intricate weave in her mind. She counted the beats of her own heart, a steady drum against the tide of indignity. This was necessary, she told herself. It was the final price for her family's survival. When the pain came, sharp and inevitable, she pressed her lips together and thought of Emma's face, of James's future, of her father spared from debtor's prison. She could endure this. She would endure this. When it was finished, the Duke rose from the bed immediately, not looking at her, and retrieved his discarded shirt from the floor. "The bargain is sealed," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You are now the Duchess of Bellingham in every particular that matters to the law. I trust you will conduct yourself accordingly." Then he was gone, the connecting door closing behind him with a soft but final click, and Clarissa was left alone in the darkened chamber, with the ache between her thighs and the certain knowledge that her life had just become infinitely more complicated than she had ever imagined possible. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she lay in the great four-poster bed, staring at the canopy above and listening to the distant crash of waves against the cliffs, wondering what she had become. Not a wife, certainly, at least not in any real sense. A prisoner, perhaps. Or simply a means to an end, a vessel for the heir the Duke so desperately needed. The days that followed established a pattern that would define the first month of their marriage. The Duke treated her with the scrupulous, cool courtesy one might extend to an unwelcome but necessary houseguest. They took meals together in the formal dining room, making stilted conversation about inconsequential matters. They occasionally walked the grounds together when the weather permitted, maintaining a careful distance, and every few nights he would appear at the connecting door and perform his duty with the same methodical efficiency, then withdraw without a word. Clarissa was given free rein of Ravenstone Hall, the extensive library, the conservatory, the gardens, but she was explicitly instructed not to attempt any social calls or to receive visitors. "Until we are certain of your condition," the Duke explained, "I would prefer to maintain our privacy. Society believes you to be recovering from the exhaustion of the wedding journey. We shall maintain that fiction." It was house arrest, politely phrased. Clarissa was a duchess in name, but a prisoner in fact, waiting to see if her body would fulfill its part of the cold bargain she had struck. She spent those early weeks exploring the vast house, learning its corridors and chambers, its servants and routines. Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, remained coolly disapproving, but the other staff seemed cautiously accepting of their new mistress. Clarissa made efforts to learn their names, to speak kindly to them, to be the sort of employer she imagined a true duchess should be. The library became her sanctuary. The Duke's father and grandfather had been collectors, and the shelves held thousands of volumes spanning centuries. Clarissa lost herself in histories and philosophies, in poetry and travel narratives, in anything that could distract her from the strange limbo of her existence. One afternoon, the Duke had occasion to pass by his study, and noticed through the open door that someone had been organizing the estate ledgers, work he had been postponing for weeks. Upon investigation, he discovered Clarissa in the estate office, her brow furrowed in concentration as she reviewed the tenant accounts. When she looked up and saw him, she flushed with embarrassment. "I apologize, Your Grace. I did not mean to intrude. I found the ledgers in disarray and thought I might make myself useful. Old habits from helping my father manage our much smaller estate." He had expected to feel irritation at her presumption. Instead, he found himself examining her work. Her entries were meticulous, her calculations flawless, and she had noted several discrepancies that he himself had overlooked. "You have a head for figures," he said, unable to keep a note of surprise from his voice. Numbers do not lie or dissemble, she replied quietly, gathering the ledgers to return them to him. They are refreshingly honest, unlike people. The comment had struck him with unexpected force. This was not the ornamental bride he had contracted for. This was a woman of genuine capability and sharp intelligence, qualities he had not thought to value in a wife, but found himself appreciating nonetheless. It was in the library that the Duke found her one afternoon, perhaps 3 weeks into their marriage. She had been so absorbed in a volume of Dante that she had not heard his approach, and she startled when his shadow fell across the page. "I did not realize you read Italian," he said, and there was something in his tone that might have been surprise or possibly approval. Clarissa closed the book carefully, marking her place with a ribbon. "My father insisted on thorough education for all his daughters," she replied. "Italian, French, Latin, and Greek. Venetia found languages tedious, but I—" She trailed off, realizing too late that she had mentioned her sister's name. The Duke's expression darkened slightly, but he did not comment on it. Instead, he gestured to the book in her hands. The Inferno. Rather grim reading for an autumn afternoon. "Perhaps appropriate, though," Clarissa said quietly, "for someone living in their own particular circle of hell." She had not meant to say it. The words simply emerged, born of weeks of loneliness and tension, and the moment they left her mouth, she regretted them. But the Duke, rather than taking offense, actually laughed, a short, bitter sound, but genuine nonetheless. "A fair assessment," he agreed. He moved to the window, looking out over the gardens with his hands clasped behind his back. "I do not suppose this situation is any more pleasant for you than it is for me." "No," Clarissa admitted, "it is not." "Tell me about yourself," he said abruptly, still not looking at her. "The true you, I mean." "Clarissa, not the woman your family pretended you to be." It was the first personal question he had asked her since that terrible wedding night. Clarissa found herself wanting to answer honestly, to offer him something real amid all the deception. "I am," she began slowly, "the quiet daughter, the scholarly one. Venetia inherited our mother's beauty and social graces. Emma, our youngest sister, has our father's charm and wit. I have always been the one with her nose in a book, more comfortable in libraries than ballrooms. You are educated then, excessively so by society's standards. I can read 6 languages, navigate spherical trigonometry, and recite long passages of poetry from memory, none of which makes me remotely suitable to be a duchess. And yet," the Duke said, turning to look at her at last, "here you are." "Here I am," Clarissa echoed, "trapped in a marriage neither of us wanted, waiting to see if my body will perform the one function that makes this entire charade worthwhile." The bluntness of it seemed to startle him. He studied her for a long moment, and Clarissa found herself unable to look away. There was something different in his expression now. Not warmth precisely, but perhaps the faintest thaw in the ice. "You are not," he said quietly. "What I expected. Not Venetia, certainly, but also not the timid, spineless creature I had assumed would allow herself to be used as you were used." "I am not spineless," Clarissa replied, stung. "I am practical and desperate. There is a difference." "Is there?" He moved closer, and Clarissa felt her breath catch. "You speak of being trapped, madam, but you chose this trap. You could have refused your family's demands. You could have revealed the deception before the ceremony. You could have—" "I could have condemned my entire family to destruction," Clarissa interrupted, rising to her feet with the book still clutched in her hands. "And perhaps I should have. Perhaps honor demanded it. But I am not a saint, Your Grace, any more than you are. I am simply a woman who made an impossible choice and must now live with the consequences." They stood facing each other across the library, and the tension between them had shifted somehow. No longer pure hostility, but something more complicated. Something that acknowledged, perhaps, that they were both victims of circumstance, both trapped by duty and expectation. "I was married before," the Duke said abruptly. "Perhaps your family told you." "They mentioned it," Clarissa replied carefully. "Your first wife died in childbed along with your son. I am deeply sorry for your loss." His jaw tightened. "Sophie was 23 years old. We had been married barely a year. She was everything a duchess should be. Beautiful, accomplished, perfectly suited to her role. And I, His voice cracked slightly. I loved her. Genuinely. Truly loved her. When she died, when they both died, I thought I would follow them into the grave. Clarissa felt tears prick her eyes at the raw pain in his voice. She said nothing, simply waited for him to continue. I swore I would never marry again, he went on, his voice hardening once more. But duty demanded otherwise. The dukedom requires an heir. And so I contracted for a marriage with a woman I had never met, believing that at least in a loveless arrangement, I would not risk the agony of losing someone I cared for. And instead, Clarissa whispered, understanding blooming in her chest, you got me. A fraud and a deception, a reminder that you cannot even control the basic terms of your own life. Yes. The word was bitter. He turned away from her, one hand rising to grip the window frame. I do not blame you for your family's sins, Clarissa. Not truly. But I cannot simply accept this, accept you. Not when every time I look at you, I am reminded of how thoroughly I have been deceived. The words hurt more than they should have. Clarissa had known from the beginning that this marriage was founded on lies, that the Duke had no reason to trust her or care for her. But hearing him state it so baldly, so honestly, made her chest ache with something she had not anticipated. The desire to be seen, to be valued, to be something more than simply a convenient womb for his heir. I understand, she said quietly, and I will not burden you with expectations of affection or regard. I will fulfill my end of our bargain, and if fortune grants us a child, I shall be a suitable duchess and mother. That is all I can offer you. He turned back to her, and for a moment she thought she saw regret flicker in his grey eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by his customary coolness. That, he said, will be sufficient. He left her then, and Clarissa sank back into her chair with trembling legs. She had learned something important in that exchange, something that changed the nature of their situation. The Duke was not simply cold and distant by nature. He was protecting himself, building walls around a heart that had been shattered once and feared being broken again. And she, Clarissa realized with a sinking feeling, was beginning to care for him despite herself. Despite the circumstances of their marriage, despite his coldness and her deception, despite everything that should have made it impossible. It was the most dangerous thing that could have happened. The weeks rolled into the 6th and then the 7th, and Clarissa began to notice subtle changes in her body. A persistent queasiness in the mornings, unusual fatigue, a heightened sensitivity to certain smells. She said nothing at first, afraid to hope or to acknowledge what these signs might mean. But when her monthly courses, already late once, failed to arrive a second time, she could no longer deny the truth. She was with child. The Duke's heir grew within her, the product of those cold, dutiful encounters in the darkened bedroom. She debated how to tell him. Some part of her wanted to delay, to keep the knowledge private for just a little longer, to savor the peculiar intimacy of carrying this secret alone. But practicality won out, as it always did. He had a right to know. This was, after all, the entire purpose of their bargain. She found him in his study one evening after dinner, bent over correspondence with the focused intensity he brought to all his tasks. She knocked softly on the doorframe, and he looked up with mild surprise. "Clarissa, is something amiss?" She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Her hands were shaking, and she clasped them together to still their trembling. "I have news," she said simply. "News that I believe will please you. I am with child." For a long moment the Duke simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he rose from his chair, setting aside his pen with careful precision. "You are certain." "As certain as I can be without a physician's confirmation. All the signs are present. I am perhaps 2 months along by my estimation." He nodded slowly, and Clarissa watched something complicated cross his features. Relief, certainly, but also something darker, something that looked almost like regret. "Then," he said at last, "it appears our bargain will stand. You are to be the Duchess of Bellingham in truth and permanence." "Yes." Clarissa found she could not quite meet his eyes. "I suppose I am." He moved around the desk toward her, and for a moment Clarissa thought he might embrace her, or offer some gesture of warmth. Instead, he simply stood before her, studying her face with that same intense focus he brought to everything. "You will take the greatest care of yourself," he said, and his voice held a note of command that had not been there before. "I shall summon the finest physician in Yorkshire. You will rest as much as possible. You will want for nothing that might ensure the health of this child. Because the child is all that matters," Clarissa said quietly, unable to keep a note of bitterness from her voice. "The heir you contracted for, the purpose for which I was obtained." The Duke's jaw tightened. "That is not—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Yes, the child is what matters. The child is everything. Do not expect me to apologize for that." "I do not," Clarissa replied, and found that she spoke truly. She had entered this bargain with her eyes open. She had no right to demand more than what had been promised. But as she left his study and returned to her lonely chambers, she found herself resting one hand against her still flat belly and whispering to the life growing within her. "You are wanted," she said softly, "even if your mother is not. You are wanted and loved, and I will protect you with everything I have." The pregnancy progressed with surprising ease through the autumn months. The Duke, true to his word, summoned a physician from London who confirmed Clarissa's condition and prescribed a regimen of rest and nutritious food. Mrs. Blackwood thawed slightly, her disapproval tempered by the practical reality that Clarissa was carrying the future Duke or Duchess of Bellingham. The Duke himself became even more solicitous of Clarissa's comfort, while somehow maintaining his emotional distance. He ensured she had everything she needed, inquired regularly after her health, but never ventured beyond the boundaries of concerned duty into anything approaching genuine warmth. Clarissa tried to accept this as the natural order of their arrangement. She devoted herself to preparing for motherhood, to reading every book on child-rearing she could find in the library, to planning nursery renovations with the housekeeper. She was determined to be the best mother possible to this child, who would inherit so much, but whose parents barely spoke except in the most formal terms. It was in late November, when Clarissa was perhaps 3 months pregnant, that everything began to unravel. The first sign came in the form of a letter, delivered by special courier from London. Clarissa happened to be in the entrance hall when it arrived, and she saw the Duke's face transform from mild curiosity to something approaching shock as he read the contents. "What is it?" she asked, moving closer, despite the unspoken rule that his correspondence was his own affair. He looked up at her, and the expression in his eyes made her blood run cold. "It seems," he said slowly, "that your sister Venetia has returned to society. She appeared at a London ball last evening, on the arm of her new husband, a Captain Thornfield, apparently recently married in Scotland. And she is, according to this letter, claiming that there has been some terrible mistake. That she is the true Mrs. Thornfield, yes, but also that she was meant to be the Duchess of Bellingham." Clarissa felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "No," she whispered. "She would not. She gave up that right when she eloped. She cannot—" "She can, and apparently she has," the Duke interrupted, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "She is spreading a tale throughout London society that she was coerced into eloping by a villainous lover, and that when she escaped and returned to claim her rightful place as my wife, she discovered her younger sister had somehow taken her place through deception and fraud." "That is a lie!" Clarissa's voice rose in desperate pitch. "She eloped willingly. She left a letter confessing everything. She has apparently destroyed or concealed that letter," the Duke finished, "and without it, without proof of her willing abandonment, her version of events is as plausible as ours. More so, perhaps, given that she is the woman whose name appears in our marriage contract." Clarissa sank into the nearest chair, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. "What does this mean?" The Duke paced the length of the hall, his agitation evident in every sharp movement. "It means, madam, that your sister has created a scandal of enormous proportions. Society is already buzzing with speculation. Some support her claim that she was the rightful bride. Others are suggesting that you somehow orchestrated this entire affair to steal a duchess's coronet. Either way, our marriage is now the subject of precisely the sort of public spectacle I had hoped to avoid." "Can she challenge the marriage?" Clarissa asked, though she already feared the answer. Legally, I mean. I do not know. The Duke's hand raked through his silver-grey hair in a gesture of pure frustration. Our marriage has been consummated. You are carrying my child. By all reasonable standards, the matter should be settled. But the fact that the contract specified Venetia by name, and you signed the register as Venetia. He trailed off, shaking his head. We shall need to consult with solicitors, immediately. The weeks that followed were a nightmare of legal consultations and growing social scandal. Letters arrived daily from London, each one bringing fresh gossip and speculation. Clarissa was portrayed alternatively as a conniving schemer who had stolen her sister's intended husband, or as a victim who had been sacrificed by her family to preserve their social standing. The Duke remained coldly furious throughout, but Clarissa noticed that his anger seemed directed more at the situation than at her personally. If anything, the scandal appeared to have created a strange sort of solidarity between them. They were both under siege, and their only hope of surviving lay in presenting a united front. It was in early December, with Clarissa now 4 months pregnant and showing unmistakably, that Venetia herself appeared at Ravenstone Hall. Clarissa was in the conservatory when Mrs. Blackwood came to find her, the housekeeper's face grim with disapproval. Your sister has arrived, Your Grace. She is demanding to see you and His Grace, immediately. Clarissa felt her hands begin to shake. She had not seen Venetia since the morning of the wedding that was meant to be hers. The thought of facing her now, after everything that had happened, made Clarissa feel physically ill. But she forced herself to straighten her spine and nod. Where is His Grace? In his study. I have taken the liberty of escorting your sister to the drawing room and posting a footman to ensure she does not wander. The implication was clear. Venetia was to be treated as an intruder, not a welcome guest. Clarissa found small comfort in that as she made her way to the Duke's study. He was already pulling on his jacket when she arrived, his expression thunderous. She has considerable audacity, he said by way of greeting, appearing here uninvited. She is my sister, Clarissa replied quietly. However estranged we have become. She is a threat to our marriage and to your position, the Duke corrected sharply. Do not mistake her for family, Clarissa. She abandoned that privilege when she eloped and then returned to spread lies. Together they descended to the drawing room, where Venetia waited with the captain by her side. Clarissa's breath caught at the sight of her sister after so many months. Venetia was as beautiful as ever, her golden hair arranged in the latest fashion, her green eyes bright with determination. But there was something harder about her now, something calculating in the way she surveyed Clarissa's obviously pregnant form. Dear sister, Venetia said, her voice dripping false sweetness. How well you look. Pregnancy clearly agrees with you, though I confess I find it rather awkward to see you in the position that should have been mine. The Duke stepped forward before Clarissa could respond, his voice cold as winter frost. You forfeited any claim to this position when you eloped with your captain and abandoned your contracted marriage. You have no business here, madam. I suggest you depart before I have you forcibly removed. Venetia's smile did not waver. I think not, Your Grace. You see, I have been consulting with my own solicitors, and they assure me that I have every right to contest this marriage. The contract was for me, not Clarissa. The promises were made to me. And while I may have made an error in judgment regarding my elopement, she cast a reproachful glance at Captain Thornfield, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. That does not nullify the legal reality that you are bound to a woman who is not the one you contracted to marry. The marriage has been consummated, the Duke said flatly. Your sister carries my heir. By any reasonable measure, the matter is settled. Is it? Venetia tilted her head, her expression taking on a cruel edge. Because my solicitors tell me that a marriage obtained through fraud and misrepresentation can be challenged, especially when the deception was so fundamental to the contract itself. And if that marriage were to be annulled, well, Clarissa's child would be illegitimate, would it not? Unable to inherit your precious dukedom. Clarissa felt the blood drain from her face. She had known intellectually that this was a possibility. But hearing it stated so boldly, hearing the threat to her unborn child's legitimacy, made her want to weep with rage and fear. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Surely you did not come here simply to threaten us." Venetia's smile widened. "I want, dear sister, what is owed to me. Compensation for the position I was denied. A settlement, shall we say, that reflects the value of a duchess's coronet." "You want money," the Duke said. And despite the fury in his voice, Clarissa detected a note of grim understanding. "You are blackmailing us." "I prefer to think of it as negotiating a fair settlement," Venetia replied smoothly. "Pay me what a duchess's dowry would have been, say £20,000, and I shall withdraw my challenge to the marriage. I shall even sign a document acknowledging that Clarissa married you with my blessing. But refuse." Her eyes hardened. "Refuse, and I shall pursue this matter through every court in England. I shall drag your names through the scandal sheets. I shall ensure that everyone knows how thoroughly you were both deceived and how questionable your heir's legitimacy truly is." The Duke said nothing for a long moment. Maximilian's mind worked through the calculations with ruthless precision. £20,000 was an exorbitant sum, a fortune that could support a gentleman's family for decades. But the cost of a public scandal, of endless litigation dragging through the courts, of the permanent stain of illegitimacy upon his heir, that was incalculable. £20,000 was the price to purchase silence and security. A bitter price, but one he would pay. Then, with visible effort, he brought his rage under control and spoke with icy precision. "You will have your settlement, £20,000, paid within the month, in exchange for a signed and witnessed document renouncing any and all claims to my title or estates. You will further agree to never again speak publicly of the circumstances of my marriage to Clarissa, and you will leave this house immediately and never return." Venetia's smile turned triumphant. "How reasonable of you, Your Grace. Captain Thornfield will provide the necessary details for the payment. I trust we need never see each other again." As Venetia and her captain departed, escorted firmly to the door by the Duke's footman, Clarissa found herself unable to move, unable to speak. The casual cruelty of it, her own sister threatening her unborn child's legitimacy for money, left her feeling hollowed out and sick. The Duke returned to the drawing room to find her still standing frozen in the center of the room. For once his expression held something other than cold distance. There was fury there, yes, but also something that might have been concern. "Sit," he ordered, guiding her firmly to the sofa. "You are pale as death, and you are carrying precious cargo. I will not have my heir endangered by your sister's villainy." "She would have destroyed my child," Clarissa whispered, looking up at him with eyes that burned with unshed tears. "Her own niece or nephew. For £20,000. "Yes," the Duke said simply. "She would have. And that, Clarissa, is why I will pay her price without hesitation. Because whatever else may be true about our marriage, whatever deceptions brought us together, I will not allow anyone, not your sister, not society, not anyone, to threaten the legitimacy of this child." The fierce protectiveness in his voice undid something in Clarissa's chest. The tears she had been holding back spilled over, and suddenly she was sobbing, all the fear and tension of the past months pouring out in great, racking gasps. For an instant, the Duke froze, every instinct compelling him to retreat from this raw display of vulnerability. It was an emotion he abhorred in himself, had spent years learning to suppress. But then he looked at the trembling of her shoulders, this woman he had forced into such an impossible position, and a different impulse, fierce and protective, won out. Hesitantly, like a man relearning a movement long forgotten, he sat beside her and placed one arm around her shoulders, allowing her to cry against his chest while his other hand came up, almost of its own accord, to rest gently against her hair. It was not comfort precisely, but it was something. And in that moment, it was enough. The settlement with Venetia was concluded within a fortnight. The documents were signed, the money transferred, and Venetia departed for the continent with her captain, presumably to live on the generous sum she had extorted. The Duke's solicitors assured them that the signed renunciation would hold up in any court, and that Clarissa's position, and her child's legitimacy, was secure. But the scandal had taken its toll. London society now knew every sordid detail of the Hargrave family's deception and Venetia's subsequent blackmail. The Duke and Duchess of Bellingham were objects of gossip and speculation. their marriage the subject of endless debate in drawing rooms across England. "We shall weather it," the Duke said one evening, as they sat together in the library, a concession to increasing social contact that had developed since Venetia's departure. "Scandals blow over eventually, and once the child is born, society will have new distractions." Clarissa set aside her book, her hand resting on her now prominent belly where the baby kicked and rolled. "Will it, though? Will we ever truly escape the shadow of how our marriage began?" The Duke was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "I do not know, but I find that I care less than I expected. Society's opinion has never been paramount to me. What matters is the continuation of my line, the security of my estates, and—" He paused and something shifted in his expression. "And ensuring that my child is born to parents who, whatever their initial circumstances, have learned to coexist peacefully." It was as close to an acknowledgement of affection as he had ever come, and Clarissa felt her heart constrict in her chest. "We have coexisted peacefully," she agreed carefully. "More than I dared hope, given the beginning." "You are not," the Duke said, turning to look at her directly, "the woman I expected to marry, in any particular. But you have conducted yourself with dignity throughout this entire ordeal. You have been resilient in the face of your family's abandonment and your sister's cruelty. And you have made Ravenstone feel less like a mausoleum and more like—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Well, you have made it more bearable." "High praise indeed," Clarissa said, but she smiled as she said it, and after a moment the Duke's lips quirked in something that might have been the ghost of a smile. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly vigorous kick, strong enough that Clarissa gasped. The Duke's eyes dropped to her belly with an expression of startled concern. "Does it pain you?" he asked. "No," Clarissa assured him. "It is simply very active this evening. Here." She reached for his hand without thinking, guided it to where the baby was moving. "Can you feel?" The Duke's hand settled over her belly, large and warm through the fabric of her gown, and they both went still as the baby kicked again, a firm press against his palm. Something extraordinary happened to his face. The careful coldness melted away, replaced by wonder and something that looked almost like fear. "That is my child," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That is my son or daughter, alive and real." "Yes," Clarissa whispered, "very much alive, very much real." He left his hand there for a long moment, feeling the movements of the life they had created together out of duty and deception. When he finally looked up at Clarissa, she was startled to see his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for this, for giving me another chance at fatherhood, despite everything." "You do not need to thank me," Clarissa replied, her own voice thick with emotion. "This child is as much mine as yours. I want them just as desperately." Something passed between them in that moment. An understanding, perhaps, or the first fragile threads of genuine connection. They had been bound together by necessity, but here, with his hand on her belly and their child moving beneath it, they were bound by something else, something that might, given time, grow into affection or even love. The Duke withdrew his hand slowly, but some of the old coldness did not return to his expression. Instead, he looked at Clarissa with a new attentiveness, as though seeing her properly for the first time. "I have been unfair to you," he said abruptly. "These past months, treating you as though you were the architect of this deception rather than another victim of it. I apologize for that." Clarissa felt tears prick her eyes. "You were angry. You had every right to be." "Perhaps, but anger is an exhausting companion, and I find I have grown weary of it." He stood moving to the window and looking out at the winter-dark grounds. "When Sophie died, I thought I would never feel anything but grief and rage again. I built walls around myself, determined never to risk caring for anyone enough that their loss could destroy me. And then you arrived, foisted upon me through deception, and I told myself you were simply one more duty to be endured." "And now?" Clarissa asked softly. He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw vulnerability she had never glimpsed before. "Now I find that you have somehow become more than that. You are intelligent and kind and brave. You make me laugh with your observations. You have turned this house into something warmer than it has been in years, and when I think of our child being born and growing up here, I cannot help but imagine you beside me, raising them together. Not as strangers bound by duty, but as... He stopped himself, shaking his head. Well, as something more. Clarissa's heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. As partners, she suggested quietly. Perhaps. He moved closer, and Clarissa held her breath. Or perhaps given time as something even closer, if you would be willing to try. I would, Clarissa said, and found that she meant it with every fiber of her being. I would very much like to try. He reached down and took her hand, raising it to his lips with a formality that was somehow more intimate than any passionate gesture could have been. Then we shall, he said simply. One day at a time. We shall try to make this marriage real. The winter passed into early spring, and with it came the final weeks of Clarissa's pregnancy. She grew increasingly uncomfortable as the baby pressed against her ribs and made sleeping nearly impossible. But through it all, the Duke was remarkably attentive, reading to her when she could not sleep, walking with her in the gardens when the weather permitted, sitting with her in companionable silence when words were unnecessary. They were learning each other, Clarissa realized, learning how to be together without the shadow of anger and deception between them. It was not love, not yet. But it was something precious nonetheless, respect perhaps, and the beginnings of genuine affection. The baby arrived on a stormy April night, after nearly 18 hours of labor that left Clarissa exhausted and wrung out. But when the physician finally placed a squalling, red-faced infant in her arms, all the pain vanished in the overwhelming rush of love she felt for this tiny, perfect creature. A boy, the physician announced with satisfaction, a healthy heir to the dukedom, Your Grace. The Duke, who had been pacing the corridor outside her chambers throughout the entire ordeal, burst through the door with wild eyes and disheveled hair. He stopped at the sight of Clarissa holding their son, and his expression transformed into something so tender it made her chest ache. "May I?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Clarissa held out the baby, and the Duke took his son with shaking hands, cradling him with surprising gentleness for a man so large and severe. He stared down at the infant's scrunched face, at the tiny fists waving in the air, and Clarissa saw tears tracking down his cheeks. He gazed at the baby's crumpled features, and a single tear fell onto the soft blanket. "He is here," the Duke whispered, his voice breaking, speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "He is truly here." Then, looking into the newborn's unfocused eyes, he added, "I am your father, and I have waited a lifetime to meet you." The baby quieted at the sound of his voice, and Clarissa watched as the Duke's entire world narrowed to the child in his arms. In that moment, she understood that whatever else happened between them, however their relationship evolved, they would always be bound by this, their shared love for their son. "What shall we name him?" the Duke asked, looking up at her at last. Clarissa considered. "I was thinking perhaps Alexander, after your father." Something flickered in the Duke's eyes, surprise and pleasure. "You remember that? You mentioned him once, when you were showing me the portrait gallery. You said he was a good man and a better Duke. I thought our son should carry that legacy." The Duke nodded slowly, returning his gaze to the baby. "Alexander Crowe. Yes, that is perfect." He stayed with them through the night, refusing to leave despite the physician's suggestion that he should rest. Instead, he sat in the chair beside Clarissa's bed, holding their son or watching as Clarissa nursed him, and his face held an expression of such complete contentment that Clarissa felt her heart expand with something very close to love. Perhaps their beginning had been founded on lies. Perhaps they had been forced together by circumstance and desperation, but their ending, or rather their continuation, would be something they chose together for themselves and for the child they had created. The weeks following Alexander's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and the overwhelming demands of caring for an infant. But they were also, Clarissa found, some of the happiest days of her life. The Duke proved to be a devoted father, spending hours in the nursery when his duties permitted, holding Alexander with a tenderness that made Clarissa want to weep. And more than that, he was becoming a devoted husband. The distance between them had not disappeared entirely. Too much hurt had been done for that. But it was diminishing day by day, replaced by small gestures of affection and care. A hand at her back as they walked, a warm look across the dinner table, quiet conversations in the library that stretched into the early hours of the morning. One evening, when Alexander was nearly 3 months old and sleeping peacefully in his cradle, the Duke found Clarissa in the conservatory, tending to the roses that had begun to bloom with the coming of summer. "I have been thinking," he said without preamble, "about the beginning of our marriage, about the deception and anger and coldness." Clarissa's hands stilled on the roses. "Yes? I want to apologize," he continued, moving to stand beside her. "Not for my anger. That was justified, I think. But for allowing it to poison our relationship for so long, for treating you as though you were your family's sins made flesh, rather than seeing you as yourself, as Clarissa." "You have nothing to apologize for," Clarissa protested, but he shook his head. "I do. Because in my determination to protect myself from being hurt again, I nearly destroyed any chance we might have had at genuine happiness. And he paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I do not wish to lose that chance. I do not wish to spend the rest of our lives as polite strangers who happen to share a child and a home. I want more than that. If you are willing." Clarissa turned to face him fully, her heart hammering in her chest. "What are you saying?" "I am saying—" He took her hands in his, and Clarissa saw that his own were trembling slightly. "I am saying that somewhere in these past months you have become precious to me. Not because of the child you bore me, though I am grateful for that beyond measure, but because of who you are. Your intelligence and kindness and courage, the way you read to me in the evenings, the way you make me laugh despite myself, the way you have transformed Ravenstone from a place of mourning into a home." "Maximilian," Clarissa whispered, using his given name for the first time since their wedding night. "I am saying—" He paused, the words clearly difficult, as though each one had to fight its way past years of carefully constructed walls. "That I find myself feeling for you in a way I swore to myself I would never feel for anyone again. That the thought of a future without you at my side has become unbearable." "Clarissa, The word seemed foreign on his own tongue. "I am falling in love with you. And I need to know—" His grip tightened on her hands. "I need to know if you might feel the same." Clarissa felt tears spring to her eyes, but for once they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I do," she said, her voice breaking. "I have tried not to, because I thought you would never see me as anything more than the fraud who trapped you. But I cannot help it. I love you, Maximilian. I love you so much it frightens me." The Duke pulled her into his arms with a fervor that was entirely unlike his previous careful distance. He held her as though she were precious and fragile and essential all at once, his face buried in her hair. "Then we have both been fools," he said roughly, "wasting months in coldness and distance when we could have been building this together from the start." "We had to find our way here," Clarissa replied, pulling back just enough to see his face. "Through anger and hurt, and finally to understanding. Perhaps we needed that journey to truly appreciate what we have now." He cupped her face in his hands, and when he kissed her, it was nothing like those cold, dutiful encounters of their early marriage. This was tender and passionate and full of promise, a kiss that spoke of new beginnings and choices freely made. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, the Duke rested his forehead against hers and smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine, that transformed his entire face. "I want to marry you again," he said abruptly, "properly this time, with your real name and no veils and no deception. I want to stand before witnesses and declare that I choose you, Clarissa, and that I will spend the rest of my life making you happy." Clarissa laughed through her tears. "We are already married, you impossible man." "Then we shall renew our vows. A private ceremony, just us and Alexander and whatever servants we trust. I want to hear you speak your true name as my bride. I want to begin again, the right way." "Yes," Clarissa said, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Yes, I would like that very much." They stood together in the conservatory as the summer sun set beyond the windows, holding each other close, and Clarissa marveled at the strange paths life could take. She had come to this marriage as a fraud, wearing her sister's gown and speaking her sister's name, a prisoner of necessity. But now, standing in her husband's arms with their son sleeping peacefully in the nursery and the future stretching bright before them, she was simply herself. Clarissa Crowe, Duchess of Bellingham, chosen and cherished and loved. The fraud had become truth, the duty had become devotion, and the marriage that should never have been had become the greatest gift of her life. Dear listener, sometimes the path to happiness begins with the most terrible choices imaginable. Like Clarissa, you may have been backed into impossible corners, forced to wear masks that were not your own, trapped by circumstances that seemed to leave no room for honesty. But Clarissa's journey reminds us that beginnings do not have to define endings, that love can grow even in the most barren soil if we are willing to do the hard work of truth-telling and forgiveness. Your past mistakes do not have to be your permanent identity. Like Clarissa, you can find your way from fraud to authenticity, from duty to devotion, from surviving to thriving. Tonight, as you rest, know that you are more than the worst thing you have ever done. You are capable of transformation, of redemption, of becoming exactly who you were always meant to be. Thank you for staying with us through Clarissa and Maximilian's journey. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of love, resilience, and hope. Rest well, dear listener, with deepest appreciation.